I have been a judge for 43 years and I have learned one thing about bullies. They always pick on people they think cannot fight back. But every once in a while, the bully picks the wrong person and everything falls apart. That is exactly what happened when Officer Derek Mason decided to mess with a man named Tommy Bear Rodriguez in a shopping mall parking lot, and what started as a simple confrontation ended with a gun pointed at me in my own courtroom. This story went viral across the world and exposed one of the most corrupt officers I have ever seen. If you believe that size does not determine who is right and who is wrong, then hit that subscribe button because what I am about to tell you will blow your mind. Let me paint you a picture. Tommy Rodriguez was not your average guy. He was 6 foot 5 inches tall and weighed 310 pounds of pure muscle. He had tattoos covering both arms, a thick black beard down to his chest, and he rode a custom Harley-Davidson motorcycle that was louder than a jet engine. People called him Bear because that is exactly what he looked like, a giant grizzly bear on a bike. But here is what most people did not know about Bear. He was a teddy bear, not a grizzly. He worked as a construction foreman during the week, and on weekends he volunteered at a youth center teaching kids how to rebuild motorcycles to keep them off the streets. He had a wife named Sophia and 3 little daughters who he called his princesses. This man would not hurt a fly unless that fly was threatening his family. On a Saturday afternoon in August 2024, Bear rode his motorcycle to the Riverside Mall to pick up birthday presents for his youngest daughter Maria, who was turning 7 years old. He parked his bike in the parking lot, walked into the mall, bought a doll and some art supplies, and came back out 20 minutes later with shopping bags in his hands and a smile on his face, thinking about how happy Maria was going to be. But when he got to his motorcycle, Officer Derek Mason was standing next to it writing a parking ticket. Bear walked up and said, "Excuse me, officer, is there a problem?" And Officer Mason turned around and looked at Bear up and down with disgust on his face, like Bear was something dirty he stepped in. Officer Mason said, "Your motorcycle is parked illegally," and Bear looked at his bike and said, "Officer, I am parked in a regular parking space." "How is that illegal?" And Officer Mason said, "This is a compact car space. Your bike is too big." Bear looked around. There was no sign that said compact cars only. There were motorcycles and trucks and SUVs parked all around him. He said, "Officer, there is no sign here and there are bigger vehicles parked all over this lot." Officer Mason stepped closer and said, "Are you arguing with me?" And Bear said, "No, sir, I am just confused about what I did wrong." Officer Mason said, "What you did wrong is you brought that piece of junk bike into a nice shopping mall where families are trying to have a peaceful day and nobody wants to see someone like you around here." Bear felt his chest tighten. Someone like him, he knew exactly what Officer Mason meant. Bear was a big Mexican-American man with tattoos and a motorcycle, and Officer Mason had already decided what kind of person he was without knowing a single thing about him. Bear took a deep breath and said, "Officer, I am just here buying birthday presents for my daughter. I did not break any law. I would appreciate it if you would just let me leave." Officer Mason smirked and said, "I am writing you a ticket for illegal parking, and if you do not like it, you can take it up with the judge," and he handed Bear a ticket for $275. Bear looked at the ticket and said, "This is not right," and Officer Mason said, "You know what else is not right? A guy like you on a bike like that in a neighborhood like this. Maybe you should stick to your own side of town." Bear's hands started shaking, but not from fear, from anger, but he did not say another word. He put the ticket in his pocket, loaded his shopping bags onto his bike, and rode home. When he told his wife Sophia what happened, she was furious. She said, "Tommy, this is discrimination. That cop targeted you because of how you look." Bear said, "Baby, what am I supposed to do? He is a cop. Nobody is going to believe me over him," but Sophia said, "No, you are going to fight this ticket and you are going to make him answer for what he said to you." So Bear did something he had never done before. He went to the mall the next day and he asked the security office if they had camera footage of the parking lot. The security supervisor was a guy named Marcus who knew Bear from the youth center. Marcus looked up the footage and his eyes went wide. He said, "Bear, you need to see this." The footage showed everything. It showed Bear parking his motorcycle in a regular parking space with no compact car signs anywhere. It showed Officer Mason walking around the parking lot looking at different vehicles and then stopping at Bear's bike and pulling out his ticket book before Bear even came back from the mall. Officer Mason had targeted Bear's motorcycle on purpose. But it got even better. The footage had audio. You could hear every word Officer Mason said, the insults about Bear's bike, the comment about Bear not belonging in that neighborhood, the racist remark about Bear staying on his own side of town. It was all recorded. Marcus made Bear a copy of that footage and said, "You take this to court and you bury that cop." So that is how Bear ended up in my courtroom on November 12th, 2024. This giant man walked in wearing a clean button-down shirt and jeans, and he sat down quietly with a folder in his hands. Officer Derek Mason walked in wearing his uniform with his chest puffed out like he owned the place. I called the case and I said, "Mr. Rodriguez, you are here to contest a parking citation issued by Officer Mason. Tell me what happened," and Bear told me the whole story in a calm, respectful voice. He told me about buying presents for his daughter, about parking in a regular space, about Officer Mason's comments about his bike and his neighborhood. Officer Mason rolled his eyes and said, "Your Honor, this man was parked illegally in a compact space, and when I tried to do my job, he became aggressive and hostile toward me." I looked at Bear. This man was built like a mountain, but he was sitting there with his hands folded looking like a gentle giant. I said, "Mr. Rodriguez, did you become aggressive or hostile?" And Bear said, "No, Your Honor. I asked questions, but I was respectful the entire time." Officer Mason said, "Your Honor, look at him. He is a biker. He is covered in tattoos. These people are always aggressive." The courtroom went silent. I put down my pen and I looked at Officer Mason and I said, "These people, what people are you referring to, Officer Mason?" Officer Mason realized what he just said and his face went red. He said, "Your Honor, I just meant that in my experience, people who ride motorcycles tend to be more confrontational." I said, "Officer Mason, do you have any evidence that Mr. Rodriguez was confrontational with you?" And he said, "Your Honor, I am a police officer. My word is evidence." I said, "Your word is testimony, Officer Mason. It is not evidence. Do you have any video footage or witnesses?" And he said, "No, Your Honor." Bear stood up and said, "Your Honor, I have video footage," and he handed the flash drive to my bailiff. We played the footage on the courtroom screen and everyone watched as Officer Mason walked around that parking lot, ignored trucks and SUVs that were bigger than Bear's motorcycle, stopped at Bear's bike and started writing a ticket before Bear even came back. Then we heard the audio. We heard Officer Mason tell Bear that he did not belong in that neighborhood. We heard him say Bear should stay on his own side of town. The courtroom erupted. Officer Mason stood up and said, "Your Honor, that footage is taken out of context," and I said, "Out of context? Officer Mason, I just heard you tell this man to stay in his own neighborhood. What context makes that acceptable?" Officer Mason said, "Your Honor, I was just doing my job," and I said, "Your job is to write fake tickets and make racist comments to taxpayers." Officer Mason's face turned bright red and he said, "I do not have to sit here and be disrespected by you," and I said, "Excuse me, you do not have to be disrespected. Officer Mason, you disrespected this man in a parking lot for no reason other than how he looks." Officer Mason took a step toward my bench and said, "You do not know what it is like out there. People like him are dangerous," and I said, "People like him? Officer Mason, sit down right now." But Officer Mason did not sit down. He said, "I am a police officer and I deserve respect," and his hand moved to his belt, to his gun. My bailiff saw it and moved toward him, but Officer Mason's hand was already on his weapon. I looked at him and I said, "Officer Mason, take your hand off that gun right now," but he did not move. He said, "You are going to dismiss this case and apologize to me or I will make sure you regret it." I said, "Are you threatening a judge in her own courtroom?" And he said, "I am telling you how this is going to go." My bailiff grabbed his wrist and pulled his hand away from the gun. Another officer rushed in and they had Officer Mason in handcuffs within seconds. He was screaming, "You cannot do this to me, I am a police officer," as they dragged him out. I looked at Bear, who was sitting there in shock, and I said, "Mr. Rodriguez, this citation is dismissed. Not only that, but I am referring this matter to the district attorney for criminal charges against Officer Mason for discrimination, filing a false report, and threatening a judicial officer." Bear had tears in his eyes and he said, "Thank you, Your Honor," and I said, "Mr. Rodriguez, you did nothing wrong. You were targeted because of how you look and that is unacceptable. Go home to your daughter and give her those birthday presents." Officer Derek Mason was charged with civil rights violations, abuse of power, and assault on a judicial officer. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison and banned from law enforcement for life. The investigation revealed he had been targeting minorities for fake tickets for over 5 years. And Bear, he became a hero in his community. He kept volunteering at the youth center and he started speaking at schools about standing up for yourself even when you are scared. The lesson is simple. Do not judge people by how they look, judge them by how they act. Bear was a giant of a man covered in tattoos, but he was more of a gentleman than that officer could ever be. If this story moved you, subscribe to this channel and share this video because justice is not automatic. It happens when people refuse to back down.